Welcome everybody to this session of the Global South Women's Forum on Sustainable Development. Before we begin, a couple of virtual housekeeping announcements. This is Rachel Ong, the technical host for this session. This session provides interpretation. Please go to interpretation to choose your language channel. This will appear as a round globe-like button at the bottom of your Zoom client or on your browser. Please mute original audio to only hear the interpreter. Welcome again. To maximize the bandwidth for all participants, we kindly request that non-speakers please turn off your videos and mute your microphones. Please also close any unnecessary programs if you are experiencing slow bandwidth. You are kindly requested to use the public chat box to engage and interact with one another. And a reminder that this session is live streamed and the recording will remain public on the ERA Asia Pacific YouTube channel. We are committed to making this space an inclusive and safe one and will not tolerate harassment of any kind. You are kindly reminded to be respectful and to avoid replicating societal prejudices and inequalities. Participants who engage in such behavior may be removed without prior notice. And with that, we're very pleased and honored to be handing it over to our session organizers for this session.
Buenos días, buenas tardes, buenas noches, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may find yourself. Welcome to today's Global South Women's Forum session on the campaign of campaigns towards macro solutions for women, the people, and the planet, presenting the efforts of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development and the Civil Society Group on Financing for Development. I'm Rosa Lizarde, the Global Director of the Feminist Task Force and co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development. Many thanks to ERA Asia Pacific, our hosts, and to you for joining us in this session where we will discuss, dissect, and discern with a view towards decolonizing the global economy and developing strategies, tools, and points of entry for macro solutions for women, the people, and the planet. The campaign of campaign is in many ways the culmination of our work this past year as the Women's Working Group and Finance for Development Watchers. With the added and unexpected crises of a global pandemic, a climate emergency, and adding on to issues of unstable debt, unfair trade rules, and unbalanced global architecture, all of which have exacerbated underlying issues of increasing inequalities, the feminization of poverty, gender inequality, and gender-based violence. Our proposal is for building a global alliance focused on collective work towards common goals around macro solutions and demands to hold international financial and governance institutions to account. We want this session to be part of the conversation that shifts norms of discourse on macroeconomic policy to include women's solutions and alternative proposals. We know we require the diversity of voices that this forum affords. So in other ways, this is our next stage of work, starting prior to the new year and taking us into 2021, not only to voice our concerns, but to press for our demands, harnessing our collective power to make connections more visible. So we're very excited, and without further delay, I want to pass this on to my partner and co-convener of the Women's Working Group on Financing for Development, Emilia Reyes. Bienvenida, welcome, Emilia. And thanks to everyone. We're very excited to have you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Rosa. And we're very excited. This feels like a party already. Thank you so much to the organizer of this Global South Women's Forum 2020. I've been in these forums in several occasions, and it is indeed a party when we're all together there. But it is definitely a pleasure and a privilege of mine to be moderating this amazing panel. And after that, to interact with all of you who are joining us today. And well, actually, for us, it's very exciting to know that we are doing this launch and in a rather strategic thinking about how to really move forward the idea of a campaign of campaigns, and doing that with our feminist colleagues is really the most exciting thing that can happen. So thank you so much. Just reminding you that we will be recording the session, and afterwards, when we turn to the session of Q&A, questions and answers, please be mindful that everything will be afterwards be put on display in a video in the website of the organizers. So I wanted us to discuss in this space, which is more intimate and more strategic, how we can promote a global alliance of movements around macro demands without staying in the stratosphere, without staying in the abstract. How can we recognize the diversity of voices, the plurality of realities, because this is crucial for the campaign of campaigns. So what we asked to our amazing panelists in this session is that we can explore what are the main ideas around mobilizing and advocacy, and in the way in which we could start mapping the challenges that we could find in the way in promoting these macro agendas on the one hand, and really enhancing the voices at the micro level, at the local level. How can we make this connection stronger? And we could, from that, start from hearing our first panelist, who is a very powerful and fierce feminist, and I have a huge admiration from her. And she's about to launch a secret toolkit that you will hear all about it on Wednesday. So I'm gonna remain quiet, but stay tuned for whatever the Feminist Response Collective is going to be launching, and this panelist is behind that amazing product. So let us welcome Diana Yahaya, who's an independent feminist researcher and activist based in Malaysia. So Diana, tell us, you have 10 minutes, and really we would like to hear from you, because you're such a big expert on international issues, but also a very well-renowned activist at the local level, and engaging with, and not only engaging, but mobilizing grassroots discussions. So Diana, over to you.
Thank you, Amelia, for all those wonderful and kind words. And the thing that we're launching on Wednesday is not too much of a secret. So we are very, very excited soon to be sharing with all of you, and hope that all of you will be able to share it widely as well. Our Feminist Response Collective Advocacy as well as Monitoring Toolkit, which we hope will, serve the cause and the purpose that we are all here today, and the work and the advocacy that we do in that trying to bring a feminist future, both in seeing the responses to this current pandemic, as well as in terms of seeing what kind of world do we want to live in as we emerge outside of this pandemic. And so just to kind of jump in straight, I know I'm speaking before two of my other amazing colleagues who I'm also looking forward to hearing from as well. And as Amelia mentioned, I think, and also as what the toolkit that we'll be launching this Wednesday really speaks to, as feminists, I think we all know and we all agree that we have always been working at the intersections of crisis, of issues, and really have been demanding for a a very long time to see systemic and structural changes, knowing that a lot of the issues that we face as feminists, as women, as marginalized group, as poor, especially as folks from the global south, are all interconnected, whether it's the macroeconomic issues, the human rights, and when we talk about macroeconomic issues, whether it's the trade related issues, whether it's talking about debt, whether it's talking about taxes, whether it's talking about investments, and so forth. So all of this we know have always been sort of interconnected. And I think this time of pandemic has sort of like brought a lot of the systemic and structural criticisms that we have to a lot of these major systems, really, really much more at the forefront. I think, and many of us as feminists, we've always known that the current system that we have never worked for us, especially for women. But what this pandemic has shown is really clearly illustrating is that it has failed the large majority of the world's population, male or female. And much of that has really been in the way that all of the macroeconomic systems, whether they are trade or tax or debt or financing, while they are administered or appears to be administered separately by different institutions, by different bodies, all, and in many cases are actually putting forth slightly different rules or rules that appear to be different from one another and not connected to one and each other, are all basically rules that are there and meant to facilitate basically neoliberal macroeconomic policies, the policies of deregulation or privatization, or in some cases re-regulations, and basically the liberalizations of markets and the free movement of capital. And in our cases, in many countries' cases, what it has really sort of like translated into is the increase of corporate capture in a lot of our lives, in a lot of our spaces, in a lot of decision making, whether you look at it from a local, national, regional, all the way to the global level. And all of this as well, kind of is really interesting when we look at the way how macroeconomic rules and the domains and the regimes where they are made in, and then you observe how the systems and the bodies and the rules made around human rights, around climate, and then we can see from there just how much of like a power and asymmetrical power imbalance there is, just by observing the amount of power that the systems and the bodies and the institution that makes our economic rules and our economic systems and imposes on our countries and on our governments, as opposed to the ones that are actually being put forth in human rights treaties and processes and bodies. And so there's a lot of ways that we know as feminists that these issues are really interconnected and needs to be viewed as a whole. And yet many of the responses and the policies and the decision makings around them are being made, effectively separately. And so I think this campaign has come really at a very particular significant moment where movements, I myself have been part of the trade movement for a really long time, and been looking at how trade has had a particularly detrimental impact on women and on countries in the global south, on our ability to regulate, on our ability to protect human rights. We've seen that a lot. And then at the same time, one of the things that I've been really interesting and been really looking at learning from other colleagues as well, is all the other macroeconomic issues, trade and so forth. I'm sorry, is somebody having their mic unmute, or is that just me? Because I keep having the interruption. Okay, great. So it's gone now. So having seen how a lot of these systems sort of like interlink, and yet there are basically no one space for us to actually tackle a lot of these issues. And it's actually really, really, I think during this moment of time, so significant to actually tackle these issues, because I think we can recognize and acknowledge that a lot of the spaces that we talk about, at least in the case of the World Trade Organization, so some of the trade domains, have found itself in a little bit of a crisis. And many of it is due to the rise of patriarchal, right-wing, conservative, macho governments that we see everywhere around the world, who are, drawing into more unilateral measures and nationalisms. And yet at the same time, it has to also be acknowledged that it also is partly due to the failure of these systems and the way it has failed the large majority of the world's population, particularly and especially and acutely women. And so I think it's really then an opportunity for us because I do believe that every crisis also does provide an opportunity, and either we as feminists and social movements steps up and utilize that moment, or we will find ourselves at the mercy of the corporations, of the elites and the wealthy and the powerful, who are already utilizing this moment of crisis to, you know, just accumulate such exorbitant and such obscene amount of wealth, which we all know, you know, what Jeff Bezos has, how much more richer he has grown just within this time of the pandemic. And so I think it's really such an important time, an important moment for us to consider some of the new systems. Some of this have been talked about, have been discussed, have been put forth and been advocated by a lot of different social movements. The proposals around alternatives, and they're not new. Even some governments have been putting forth different kind of alternative models to the current economic growth driven development model. I know in the Latin America, you know, they have different kind of model like the Buen Vivir, or, you know, different sort of like trade systems such as the ALBA. In Asia Pacific, we have countries who are trying to promote a gross happiness index instead of the GDP, which is the standard measurement that all other countries in the world are going. And so the idea of alternatives is certainly not new. I think a lot of movements, a lot of movements, a lot of governments even have been actually really looking at different alternatives to the current system that we have. And even within the trade rules as well, one of the discussion that we have been having is really thinking of what kind of alternative trade system that we could have to the current one, because trade in and of by itself is not necessarily bad, but governments being compelled to liberalize their market and so forth, that's a different thing altogether. And so an idea about a new trade system has been something that a lot of different movements have been also kind of like putting forth as a counter argument to the current multilateral trade system, which is sitting within the World Trade Organization. And the importance of having a kind of alternative proposal from movements is also really important, because I think, as a lot of like trade justice advocates know, some of the successes that we have seen with the WTO reaching the current crisis that it is right now is really because of the strong, powerful, you know, mobilization from civil society and social movements from around the world, including feminist group as well. But those successes have also led governments to enter into all of these secretive multilateral trade agreements happening outside. I'm sure many folks have heard of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, CETA, TTIP, Mercosur, and the list goes on and on and on, which are all trade agreements being negotiated outside of the World Trade Organization. And so an alternative, so that we don't have, when we make these wins as movements, governments going through much more secretive, regressive policies, is really, really important. And then at the same time, to consider a whole system where the trade issues and the tax issues and the debt issues and the financing for development and the rules being made around investment policies or investor state. Sorry, I got muted just now. And so the rules being made around trade, around taxes, around debt, and as well as the rules being made around our human rights, the rules being made around climate change are not being considered separately in separate domains and being decided by people who carry powers differently in different spaces. I think it's really an opportunity to sort of like try and tie and bring all of this together, and to bring all of these different movements together, which is of course not going to be easy, but I think to consider what kind of new system which could help us from an international and a multilateral perspective regulate as well as act in solidarity, not just between states as well as between movements, to try and achieve the sort of like feminist future that we all want to see, and in all of these different domains of macroeconomics as well as macro policies that are impacting on our lives. And I'll end there.
Diana, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And you know, with you, I guess we can always discuss, because the challenge of a campaign such as this with all of these macro demands is that we're really talking about reshaping the international financial architecture. So that is in itself a huge challenge. And I know you have plenty of amazing and uh, like pioneering ideas on how we can do that. And then, but that is a level of the challenge. And then the other level is precisely what you were mentioning about making this connection on the ground and making this connection amongst movements, even amongst ourselves as feminists, as you were saying. I mean, you have been making all this transit between different spaces, and therefore you are also some sort of collecting element in those different spaces. But then we have to look outside and keep on engaging with others. And this discussion about the technicality as opposed to the huge powers we need to move, as you were mentioning very clearly, that is, I think, very great food for thought as we're starting this discussion. So thank you for that. And I'm going to propose that we hear the next two speakers, and then I'm going to allow also the speakers and the audience to engage in between each other, because I think these starting points are necessarily leading us to many conversations. And if you check out the link of the Campaigns of Campaigns website that I pasted in the chat, you can start seeing how we are planning to have these overarching principles like human rights, gender equality, environmental integrity, democratic governance, the well-being of people, a just transition for the people and the planet, etc. And then this package of macro demands that are all interconnected, we are thinking that will really help facing the biggest challenges of our time, like Diana was mentioning. And at the same time, we cannot foresee a world in which we are losing one of those fights and without undermining the advancement of the others. So I'm gonna invite now our next speaker. She is Tete Nera Lauren. She's working with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and also APWLD and many other hats. I would say she's also one of my dearest sisters. And so I would just like to invite her to the floor and hear what are her perspectives in terms of mobilizing and advocacy in these regards. So welcome, Tete.
Thank you very much, Emilia, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. So happy and honored to be in this space. I really feel like this is a very intimate conversation among sisters, among feminists, activists, and advocates. So I was thinking, how do I follow after Diana? Because she's pretty much laid out everything, making those interconnections and outlining the challenges for everyone. What are the main obstacles that we are facing? So I don't know if I can follow convincingly after Diana, but I'll try. All right. Just last week, I was also speaking in a panel about the United Nations 75th anniversary. And in that panel, I was talking about the context and the role of civil society and social movements in these times. So let me share with you some of the things that I've shared in that webinar panel, and maybe we can pick up a thing or two. All right. So to say that we are facing very difficult circumstances at the moment is an understatement. I'm sure every one of us would agree to that. We have experienced the profound impacts of the multi-layered inequalities that have been exacerbated and exacerbates the many vulnerabilities already existing even before the pandemic. So imagine, from mobilizing in great numbers out in the streets in 2019 until the early part of this year, we are now facing lockdown isolations. Much of our work as civil society and social movements has become harder. A lot of our activities have been put on hold, and the communities that we work with have become very difficult to reach. So the question now is, how do we mobilize social solidarity in an era of physical distancing? So from asking and challenging the big questions on power or the lack of it, we refocused our energies, learning new skills, like this Zoom technology and whatnot. And we refocused our energies on emergency responses to urgent issues that many of our communities faced. So, how do you deal with hunger, joblessness, displacement, human rights violations, and many, many other problems, along with, how do we face a new wave of rights restrictions. Many of these have been imposed under the pretext of pandemic response. So our fundamental civil liberties, the right to information, right to assembly, the right to resist, no, have all been curtailed and restricted as we see many rights defenders and critical voices are silenced, harassed, and killed. So I'm from the Philippines, and that is one of our biggest issues right now, where the government has launched into a rabid, mad dog, systematic, structural crackdown on everyone, lawyers, church people, feminists, indigenous. So virtually, it's tierra libre as far as cracking down red tagging is concerned in the Philippines. Um, so nonetheless, we continue to explore and adapt new ways of organizing and expressing our resistance to the many divides and power imbalances magnified by the pandemic, as we also express our opposition to so-called solutions that reproduce the same inequalities existing before COVID. So in this sense, the campaign of campaigns brings into spotlight our role as civil society and social movements to connect those dots, between the different struggles of our diverse movements, whether it's a struggle for economic justice, gender, climate justice, racial, etc. And not only are we trying to connect those dots, but we are also trying to reclaim and rewrite, her story. So it is our job to expose and oppose. For instance, let's name it, a lot of the so-called solutions being talked about in many of these intergovernmental spaces is about greening capitalism. You know, they expect us to believe that the same system that has put profits over people and planet can be made over to solve the very problems it has created and intensified. So, for instance, we all know, no, the 20th century neoliberalism and the package of liberalization, deregulation, privatization. It's not just about the economics, but also neoliberalism. This dominant paradigm is also about creating macro structures and governing institutions to protect and promote markets. And it is now our job to rewrite and reclaim the future. So, in the face of this dominant economic model, there are a lot of calls for stronger solidarity, international cooperation, climate positive recovery. Just last Saturday was the 5th anniversary of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And it was just like I felt like I've seen and heard all of this before, because that is the new mantra that they are trying to push forward. No, discussions around climate positive recovery, net zero, carbon neutrality, nature-based solutions, they all ring hollow, because these are all with the hopes of pushing capitalism still to provide solutions to the many multi-layered problems that we are experiencing and the problems that are exacerbated by the pandemic. So it's imperative for us in civil society and social movements to make sure that economies work for people and planet and not the other way around. There is a need for profound transformations and not just cosmetic changes to the global economic, trade, finance, investments, architecture that we are all faced with. So in that sense, this campaign of campaigns, macro solutions, one of our key demands here is about accountability. Accountability, because we need to ask, no, how can we be resilient? That's a very much maligned and abused term nowadays, resilience. No? How can we be resilient to many of these shocks when the root causes of these vulnerabilities remain unaddressed? When the solutions that are put forward reinforce and reproduce the structural inequalities? I'm also very, very pissed off that in many of the intergovernmental discussions, they always like to highlight communities of practice, you know, micro solutions. It's like community A did this, community B did this, let's scale up, let's replicate. But I think, you know, while this is good, these are pocket-sized solutions. And you can even say that these are trophies. And these solutions, these examples of communities of practice will not work unless there is an overhaul of the entire system. For me, focusing on the, you know, small pocket-sized solutions is a bit of romanticizing the way out. You know, we cannot go for tokenistic solutions. So I'm optimistic about our campaign of campaigns because, you know, desperate times need desperate measures. And I think that is civil society and social movement strength. And we thrive because there's no other option. But let's all be pragmatic. We are launching this campaign without any clear recipe, without any clear roadmap on how we are going to, you know, make inroads, actually make a difference and make changes. But we have very little options. No? So I think our main the main thing that's going for us with the campaign of campaigns is because our hearts are in the right places. No, civil society and social movements, we are storytellers. We tell the stories of what's wrong, what is not right in our societies, in the world, but we are also dream weavers. In that sense, we weave our dreams of a better future for everybody. We dream of a better planet for everybody, and we dream of a future where all our movements and struggles will be interconnected. Muchas gracias. Looking forward. Thank you.
That was remarkable. And, you know, I was thinking as I was hearing you, and I started moderating in this role, but, you know, I was thinking how the relevance of sisterhood, you know, and how these communities of activism has also become our families. I was thinking also in the special sisterhood I have with Diana, in working with her in New York or in Geneva, plotting and thinking about, you know, it's everywhere in your mind, or you, and now our next speaker, Ale, and in how we keep on going back to these moments, not only to think on how to transforming the world, but also at the same time how we are transforming each other. And I think that with all of those, as you were saying, siloed solutions, or those fake celebration of a Paris Agreement that is really disappointing, we really have these roots that we keep on bonding, and a space like this forum is really special. I mean, I see our colleagues, our dear Priyanti, our dear Yiping, and many others here joining us. And it is like, despite the distance, we are here together, and we are still making this joint effort. And I'm gonna say also the bad news, that is because we are losing on every ground, but at the same time, this closeness is also keeping us all inspired. So I'm gonna also give the floor now to another inspiring feminist and very, very dear to our hearts, Alejandra Scampini. She's speaking here also on behalf of Dawn and Poder, and doing a fantastic job in several fields. Of course, we want to dig her brains on many issues, but I also wanted to pose a specific question to her regarding the World Social Forum. Besides all of your many spaces, I think that is a remarkable opportunity as well to connect with each other as movements in this sorority fraternizing. So we look forward to hearing you, dear Ale. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for the invite. I'm really happy. I'm in Uruguay. It's 11:36 p.m. And the good news is that I already had my drink and I feel fantastic. So I hope that I can make sense of what I prepared. I'm very happy that the Women Working Group on FFD invited Dawn and Poder to this session, also because this discussion is part of a Women Global Forum on Sustainable Development, led by Asia Pacific women. So also the opportunity of intersecting issues, but also continue growing a transnational feminist movement. This is key. So thank you very much for inviting us. So what I'm going to try to share, and I like the tone that we are using here. I couldn't use any other tone at this time of the day, but very relaxed and very also in confidence to tell you some of the insights that we have been collecting through our work this year with Dawn, especially around the Feminist Economic School, where we went a little bit in depth on some of the issues that impact on labor rights, especially labor rights of women. And so this work opened spaces to talk about, digital justice, the future of work, corporate power, corporate capture as a new phenomenon, not new, but with new dimensions, and also issues of regulation of corporate capture and of corporate power, and what this has to do with multilateralism, what kind of multilateralism we want, and what this has to do with the movements, with our movements, and how this is useful for the campaign of campaigns. I think that the campaign of campaigns comes in a very interesting moment. As Ted and Diana were saying, out of crisis, we always said that solutions are there. We have been saying the solutions for a while, and we have to be part of the solution. Women and sexual dissidents have to be part of the solution. We are in a time that we had, in terms of the crisis, I think that we have passed through different moments in which we can say we have new evidence. We have the opportunity of having collected new stories, new evidence of how this crisis and all the different layers of the sanitary crisis, the financial crisis, the care crisis, the humanitarian crisis, has to do with, women's rights and women's livelihood. So particularly on the issue of the dismantling of labor rights, the increasing of digital labor as the panacea for the future, and the lack of regulation, these are things that come all together. So what we are saying is that what is new in the context, and I think Diana and Ted pointed a little bit on this, is that the volume, the power of these big transnationals, especially the platform transnationals, all these Amazons and Facebook and Netflix, right, are the bigger ones. Are their products, their economies are larger than state economies. And in this process of accumulation from the side of elites, the states have been reduced their own power. They have retreated in their own realm. There is erosion of democracies, and there are two things that are simultaneous, right? And we have to pay attention to this. One is the process of deregulation. Everything goes deregulated, right? Deregulation of labor, deregulation of the action of the companies, deregulation of transnational finances, and at the same time, a tendency of advances in terms of technology, advances on digitalization. So the more precarious our jobs are, the more there is an increase in digitalization. So there is like a parallel between these two processes. And in Dawn and with Anita Gurumurthy from IT for Change, she's showing this, you know, the more it increases the digital experience, digital technologies, the more the platforms invest in this, the more poverty, right? So in this moment in which we are launching this campaign, what we are seeing is a state that is characterized by these processes of deregulation, accumulation of technological advances in terms of transport, in terms of communication. We have a new form of seeing at the value chain. The products can be dislocated, confirmation that global companies can be, and their equipments can be transported and located somewhere else, and the product can be delivered somewhere else. So all dispersed in the world, and this sounds more smart, right? The new smart economics. So in this tendency, the market continues to be, you know, the key for everything. And the state is the poor system, inefficient, corrupted, and the companies come, you know, with a new form of looking at the phenomenon of producing. But in that process, what we are seeing as feminists is that where are the women in this future, right? In this future of labor. And what we are seeing is, and you can see all the stories that we have collected, women across the value chain are in the more precarious, in the more flexible, the more vulnerable. There is increasing violence against women, more poverty, displacement, attacks, sexual attacks. So all the vulnerabilities on women are increasing in this time of less state regulation and more co-option from the corporates. So we are in a situation, especially with COVID, that the companies have been using the excuse of the COVID to continue advancing on their own profits, and with the excuse of COVID, more precarity, more flexibilization, more privileges for them because they are the motors, you know, they are the engines for success, and the state has to provide for them, and in detriment of labor rights. So it is a process that can be also seen at global level. We have been discussing many times, you know, a campaign of campaigns for the global. For what multilateralism? What are we talking about? We just have 2 or 3 minutes. What is our role? Who are our partners in those spaces? So there is a weakening of the global space, and our states are co-opted, and they need to respond to the needs of the private sector instead of their mission, their true emission, that is their citizenship. So in this crisis that we were talking about, with labor rights at the heart, with more indebtedness, because of the solution to the crisis brings more indebtedness and more instability, economic instability. I think that it also creates an opportunity. What we are seeing in the couple of months in our region from Latin America is that the mobilization of trade unions, of the youth, of the indigenous groups, of the communities affected by abuse of corporate sectors has not stopped. We have been locked down. We have been told not to move from our houses, but we haven't been silent. So the testimonies that we have from, you know, the recent passing of the abortion law in Argentina in deputies, this week and next week they are going to advance, or the many Afro-descendant women winning posts in the local governments in Brazil. There is the first Black woman trans that got elected in Sao Paulo for the council. There is a new law for economic empowerment in Guatemala being voted. There are mobilizations in Chile that continue to force the process towards a new constitution. You know that they removed the old constitution that belonged from the times of Pinochet. In Mexico, all the pressure from civil society, human rights defenders, attacking the abuse of corporates like Grupo Mexico or the Maya train, all the exposure of the abuses of corporates that have made some companies like beer companies become essential during COVID times. So, and there are more and more advances. So I would say that, yes, we have to use the campaign as a moment to take stock of what has happened in COVID times. If COVID times have enacted the worst of capitalism, let's make it clear what is our analysis on that. And let's use that analysis to also bridge alliances with different groups. It will not be very organized institutional groups. It will be women on the streets. The women that have mobilized in Chile may not be part of any organization. The young women in the Green Tide in Argentina, some of them belong to campaigns, some others are just there on the streets. The ones in Guatemala fighting, you know, for compensation during dictatorship or compensation for the abuses of corporate power of the palm oil extractive companies, or the ones that are all around Latin America and all around the globe, sometimes are not the ones, our usual suspect friends. So the campaign of campaigns is an opportunity to link these local demands, these local realities, these local expressions and opportunities, and take it to another level, and also learn between each other. The corporate capture of the state is a must, and it's not a feminist issue. I hope that with the campaign of campaigns, we try to understand better what the corporate capture of our states, the ways in which elites, corporates, with their lawyers, with their lobbies, with their monies, come and convince our governments that they need to pass certain laws very quickly so that they can start a port or continue with extractivism industry near certain, you know, protected and ancestral territory, or the ways in which they go to UN and speak on behalf of the civil society. Those are things that are still not part of the feminist issue, and we have to make it stronger. There are plenty of opportunities that the campaign of campaign can create case studies that can really be used to harness our global analysis. The process for the binding treaty is a key.
1 minute.
How much time I have?
1 minute.
1 minute. The binding treaty is something that maybe you are more acquainted, but the World Social Forum, it's another, in January 23rd until the end of January this year. It's gonna be virtual, but I think it's a great moment for the Women Working Group to organize something with us and to there explore, because there is where campaigns can get more ideas and become more creative. Just, you know, having a pass the mic idea on what a campaign of campaigns can take and shape it for different moments in the year. And as Dawn, we are part of, you know, a large group. So I invite you, as part of the campaign of campaigns as we are, I invite you to stay tuned for the World Social Forum and also for the binding treaty process that starts next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Ale, and thank you for reminding us that there are so many challenges that have been unveiled by this current crisis, like our awesome colleagues from IT for Change have been saying that we are turning into a digitalized capitalism. And it reminds us over and over on the different layers, as you were mentioning, the corporate capture of the state, plus the role of the financial sector that is also still very hidden to many people, but is actually pushing all of these of these trends, like financing fossil fuels even more than states themselves, etc. So there are many layers here that are interconnected, and it is thanks to the alliance of so many knowledge and collective discussions and learning that we are able to tie the knots. And this is the wealth of an idea like the Campaign of Campaigns, and also supporting specific efforts like the ones that you are doing in the binding treaty, in which we know the entire fate of humanity is at stake there, and you're fighting the struggle all alone. So this is really a time in which we need to put all our heads and efforts together and support all of those titanic efforts to shift the path that humanity and the planet is going now. So this has been fantastic, and I'm sad we're only going to have like 10 minutes of Q&A, so that we can also hear our audience present here and their ideas, their strategies, their tools. But of course, we had this very fantastic lineup of panelists. So I'm opening to ask here in the, if people can raise their hand or paste their question in the chat, or raise their hand so that you can also engage with our panelists. Or if our panelists, while we wait for some question, do you want to address each other? You're most welcome. Any questions from the audience or comments? I just see that our dear Priyanti is reminding us that there is a session with IT for Change later today, and nobody wants to miss that one. But anyone who wants to interact with our panelists on any issue? Yes, go ahead, Yiping. And just reminding you that we are recording, and this will be then pasted in the website of the organizers, so that feel free just to use your first name or your initials if that is how you feel better. Go ahead, Yiping.
Hi, thank you so much for organizing this panel, and thank you for all the speakers, especially Ali has to stay so late from her region. I really appreciate all your presentations. I have just one question to ask. From what you have shared, you have mentioned, each of you, I think anyone can respond to this question. From what all the speakers have shared, this COVID has actually provided this opportunity to reimagine a world, reimagine the policy response towards more equality, more just, and some countries already had a policy actually to escalate their, expand their social protection floor that include migrants, that's extended to the people that not included in the past. So that is some positive direction. However, there's also a tendency in at least some countries or in some regions that the response to the COVID by many countries, by many authorities, is quite militarized, anti-human rights. So we see the both kind of tendency, that's kind of polarized tendency as a response to the COVID. So as a feminist and a human rights activist, how we can make sure, this policy direction will go to that direction that we prospect, rather than at using this crisis towards more regression, more negative impact. So that's my question. Do you have any strategies or any good suggestions? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yiping, for that. And you're reminding us, as well as that the link interconnection between democracy and our macro demands, right? We need also a democratic space so that our proposals are nourished and are nurtured. So this is very relevant. I want to ask if anybody else has a comment or question so that we can address them both in a final round with our panelists, so that then we can turn to the work with all of you. So anybody has another question or comment? You can write it in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, we don't seem to have any other comments, so I'm inviting each of the panelists to either address Yiping's question, which is very crucial now that we're not only seeing the increase of nationalistic responses and also very openly fascist attacks against populations or groups of populations, but also these multi-layered obstacles, let us call them. So let us go again in the order in which we had our intervention. So Diana, perhaps you want to take the mic first?
Sure. I think that what we've seen during this time of pandemic in terms of like responses from governments have been kind of like two sides. On one end, I think there is a degree of which there are a number of policies which governments in the past would have said is not politically feasible. We have no money for it. There are no financing for it. It's just not possible actually taking place in this time. And I think a lot of policies around social services, public social services, around universal basic incomes, which were, things that many governments would said would not possible or not something we could extend to non-citizens, actually being put in place in this time of pandemic, right? And so suddenly all the money that governments have previously said they did not have, suddenly it's all there, right? So apparently we did had the money for it. There was just simply no political will. So there is the first question of like, how do we keep some of those policies that have already been put in place continue beyond this pandemic as well? Because these are basically effectively, many of them, the same policies that we've been calling for, or many of the different social movements and feminists have been calling for, but were never able to achieve until this pandemic came and hit us. So I think that's the first side of things. I think the second side of things is really on the rise of all of the patriarchal, right-wing, nationalistic, macho heads of authoritarian governments, like all a long list of every horrible person we have leading a country in different parts and corners of the world right now. And those are very, very real as well. And they have an impact not just on many of the responses nationally, but also how we respond as a world and from a multilateral and at the multilateral space and level as well. And so I think in a lot of cases for me, I recognize that many of these rises, sits with the fact that a lot of the systems that we previously had failed us. And people need to turn to something, and what they turn to is often a question of like whether who is there and who's positioning itself. So I think in many cases social movements and progressive have to be able to, we have been doing it and we're doing it under tremendous challenges, but we do have to continue to find a way to position ourselves as the alternatives when we know that many of this current system have failed many people around the world and have disillusioned many people and pushed them further to the right side as opposed to the more progressive movements. And I think us as feminists and social movements, we're also particularly unique because we don't have, when we talk about defending some of these multilateral spaces, we don't have such a blind, sort of defense of these spaces. I think we recognize that many of these spaces are weakened, have failed us in different ways, and we recognize that what we need is to seek some sort of balance between, for example, a state's policy space, but then also like how do we ensure solidarity across countries and between movements, and how that solidarity can continue and can continue to shape what we have nationally in terms of policies as well as globally. And so I think it's really what I have found. I think it's important for us to continue to push is that we recognize that there are criticisms in many of these spaces that we do operate in, that we are defending, and that we are sometimes also challenging or trying to dismantle, and why some of those criticisms that have been, pushing people further towards all this authoritarianism, unilateralism, and nationalism is real. But then ultimately what we want is not a complete retreat to, unilateralism and everyone in their own country within their own nationality and borders, because we know that the world we live in, cannot be responded in such a way anymore. If many of our issues were issues that you only face singularly as one country or as one nation, maybe, but that is clearly not the case for many of the world's issues that we're facing, whether it's the climate, whether it's the economy, whether it's health. We have seen how any government's unilateral responses to the current health pandemic is insufficient. You can only respond to it in a collective way, not just as states, but also as movements and in solidarity. And so I think that is probably one of the ways that we need to continue to position ourselves, in that we understand those opposition, but we are not calling for like a complete retreat to unilateralism, but we do want a different kind of multilateralism, and one that works for people, for movements, and in the name of solidarity and cooperation, and not for, the interests of certain parties or the elite few.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I'm being reminded that we are late in the schedule, so I'm gonna give our speakers as well other 2 minutes to wrap up, and so that we can still remain here and engage all together in the next session that is more interactive. So Tetet, go ahead.
I think our campaign of campaigns must also have anti-militarism at its core, because we have a very sharp critique about capitalism, but the linkage between capitalism and how militarized state violence against communities resisting capitalism and corporate-led destruction is not really that very obvious yet in our articulation of the campaign of campaigns. So I think at different levels, at country level, we need to continue calling out fascist, misogynist governments that really trash, human rights and everything. At regional level and global, we need to set the bar, and we need to continue challenging all of those institutions, that they are here not just for monitoring, what is the progress 5 years after of the SDGs or whatnot, but for multilateralism to remain relevant, they have to set the norms and set a good example. We know that ultimately it's about an assertion of people's sovereignty, and we're prepared that there will be backlashes against against communities asserting people power. So I think we need to be cognizant of all of these challenges facing us. But then again, it's all about building people's power and reclaiming our spaces in order for multilateralism to remain legitimate and relevant. Otherwise, we make our own multilateral institutions. Yeah. Thank you.
And what a closure. Thank you, Tete. Ale, go ahead. 2 minutes.
Yeah, so 2 minutes. So lots that you have said. I think that departing from what I said, the campaign of campaign linking with what's going on in the streets is crucial. We cannot have a campaign of campaigns just elaborating from, statements and our language. It has to be grounded on the fantastic things that are happening on the ground. I think the issue of the money and the connections between corporates and the religion, fundamentalism, and also paramilitares is crucial. There are studies already taken. I think Dawn did some work on illicit financial flows and paramilitary funds. So I think demonstrating where is the money is still very valid, and also monitoring how the monies that have been, labeled COVID for women has been used. And we need to engage the people affected by COVID in saying how it was used. I think that there is a lot of funds coming to our national context saying this is for COVID, this is for women, this is for the elder, this is for the kids, and we have no transparency whatsoever. Let's dig in there. Let's use the right to information. Let's use the right to associate. Let's use all our rights to really make sure that we investigate and we become the valid voice in this process. And the campaign of campaign is the big umbrella that can help us work together. It will be like what unite us, right? All of us come from different sectors, from different practices, from different knowledge, but with the campaign of campaign, we will be able to reach global level and tell them we are the force, we are the solution.
Thank you so much, Ale. And with this, we're gonna close the panel. I mean, there is no better way to do that than acknowledging the people power and our collective efforts. So I'm gonna pass now the mic to my colleague Rosa. She will be leading the dynamic for a consultative process now. So go ahead, Rosa. And thank you to our amazing panelists.
Thank you, Emilia, and really just wonderful input. Thank you, Ale, Tete, Diana. That was really fantastic. I was taking notes because in this part of the session, and I think we may have just about 15 or so minutes, just so we have a little time for the closing, we want to look at strategies, tools, and lessons learned. And you all have highlighted many of those. We want to use this interactive tool called the mural, mural in Spanish, the wall. So I think, Adriana, if you can post it in the chat. So we want to get your input, those in the audience and the participants. Again, this is live, so it's only going to be happening during the initial session, which is right now. So please, if you link on this link here for the mural, we will be if we can also show screen share that mural, we will be asking you to select and share strategies, tools, and lessons learned. Our hope for this campaign of campaigns is really to look at what strategies have been successful for you, what strategies do we want to use to establish links between the macro demands and the local needs. In terms of tools, we want to look at what tools should we consider, or if we need to develop as activists to make more visible our efforts to achieve global demands. And then the lessons learned, what are lessons learned in the advocacy and policy arena related to macro solutions. So if you are linking in, and I see that it's being populated, what you can do is you double click on one of these big squares of strategies, tools, lessons learned, double click, and you will and activate a small square or one of those post-its, and then you can go click on the T there as a tool, and you can text, start writing what strategy, tool, or lesson learned you can put into that square. Again, once you double click, just on the right hand side there, you see the T in the bar. Click the T and then you can write. So you have to go to the chat, and I'm going to be going through some that were mentioned in the panel discussion just now. And so Diana, and I know you can fill these in for yourself, but I want to highlight some that Diana, Tetet, and Ale mentioned. And Diana mentioned the alternative, in a sense, the alternative trade rules of the Buen Vivir, of the ALBA, as alternatives to the WTO regional. These are regional efforts, and also in terms of countering what she mentioned, countering the fossil fuel industry. So it's really looking at that as an alternative, which can be a lesson learned, which can be a tool. So thank you, Adriana, for helping that out. Tetet highlighted one demand, and I think the demand we can use as a strategy, and that's accountability. Accountability as a demand. And she also said she was pissed off, and I highlighted that because I think being pissed off is a trigger for action. And so it's having that passion to act, and that is a strategy, and it's a strength to mention. She also mentioned about romanticizing solutions. So I think that's a lesson learned, that we don't want to be romanticizing, or want others to be romanticizing our solutions. So if we can also highlight that as well. Alejandra mentioned right from the start the feminist economic school. I think that is an incredible strategy or a tool that we can build on, emulate, work with you to build the new leaders, the new economists. So a feminist economic school, I think, was a really great mention by Ale. She also mentioned about all the stories that we've been collecting, and with the feminist response, and we'll hear more about it in the next couple of days, but collecting of our stories and creating new evidence as a strategy that can be highlighted here. The mention of the and I believe that this was Diana, the pocket size counter. Let's counter that with the large size pockets. Let's counter that with moving away or combating this pocket size strategy that's been utilized. There was also mention of the women in the future labor areas as a strategy, countering the digitalization and this whole movement toward removing jobs, increasing poverty. That is a lesson learned. That is something that we we really do need to watch. And not only is it a lesson learned, I mean, I think that it is developing new knowledge around that. And Ale mentioned IT for Change and what they're doing, which is so important. You all mentioned this, crisis as an opportunity. And yes, that there's that saying, like, don't let a crisis go to waste. But what value do we want to put to that? What type of utilization of a crisis do we want to embody? Alejandra asked a really good question in the chat. How do we bring others into this movement? And I want to just pose that question to you all, and you can put it in as a strategy or as a tool if people want to answer that question. How do we bring others into this movement? And the need to continue to call out against fascism, the need to challenge those that are continuing to take up our space, those that are approaching and deteriorating multilateralism. Let's put, what tools do we know of to counter that? And then I think another really important point that was mentioned was linking what's going on in the streets with this work, with building this movement of an umbrella of issues being looked at together: debt, trade, poverty, looking at a reform of the economic and global architecture. How do we really link it to what's happening on the streets? And we have to link it with all the different movements, with the labor movements, with the anti-violence movements, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the indigenous peoples movement, with the LGBTIQ movement, all of these. So how do we do that? Take a square and let us know you're part of these solutions, and we want you to stay engaged. We want you to be part of this. Tell us how you think we can link this to what's happening in the streets and on the ground, and in all your movements that you're involved in. So and if you're not able to manage this online mural, just write it in the chat and we'll save it and we'll put it in there, and let us know, who it is that is saying that. Just write it in the chat. That's the easiest thing to do. But we want it to be more interactive. And how do we include you under this big umbrella of efforts? As Ale brilliantly closed her Q&A, we are the force. Ale, that was great. We are the force. So how do we stay engaged in this process? So I'm just throwing out these questions for you to pick up on and to answer. How do we break the silos between our movements? Very, very good question that is in the chat. So I want to just see if there's anything in the chat. Priya Priyanti says, think it's about bringing the different social movements together because, as Diana said, and as much as debt, trade, finance, etc., are addressed by different institutions, social movements can also be somewhat siloed, and we know that very much. Alejandra mentions that the World Social Forum in January is a good space to break silos, and that's true. It always has been. I understand it's going to be virtual. So how do we do that? And what tools do we have to break down those silos? Also, Alejandra is saying engaging in the binding treaty is also a way to break silos. Yes, definitely, because the connecting tissue there with the binding treaty and with these other issues under the umbrella is the big issue of human rights and how human rights connects all of these areas. And helps bring coherence, certainly at the UN, and we can't lose that space at the UN. And it's a corporate creep is happening at the UN. So Ale says we need creativity for our television advocacy. Interesting. That's a really great point. And Connie Pachulo says, I think the role of art in making these connections across movements and communities is really important. I would totally agree. Yesterday's session by the Fearless Collective was a really inspiring example. Oh, fantastic. Thank you for mentioning that. And I hope that people mention this session and any subsequent sessions that you all are engaging in. Any other strategies, tools, and lessons learned that you might want to highlight, or maybe you mentioned them already in the mural? Why don't you just put them in the chat and can make sure that everybody hears and knows about them. Always inspired by the efforts behind the campaign of campaigns. Thank you, Connie. And you know, it's just really starting. It's ending the year, really a culmination of our work, our series of webinars, macro solutions for women, the people, and the planet. And then it's using it to kick off the new year, which we're so hopeful about, at least the new year for some cultures, a little later for others. But it's really to start the year with hope, with, you know, we've been battered this year, but we have to really start energized and hopeful, and really engage with different partners. Alejandra says we should be more active with people in parliaments and local governments, and those spaces are key. It's true, because those spaces are also shrinking. We have a lot of strategies here, a lot of tools, and a lot of lessons learned, which we will be distilling. We're gonna look at this, collect it, cull through, and really, you know, bring it back to you all in a series of work with networks and organizations and partners that are working in the different areas. And I think that, you know, coming together, not just one, but two, but many, in pushing forward this message is what's really going to propel this campaign into just what has been really, the thinking of people who are seeing that enough is enough. Too much has already been dismantled. And in terms of debt, we just heard this morning with our debt partners that 2021 is going to be a devastating year. And we know that COVID has really been devastating to women and girls. So we have to turn that around. I want to take this opportunity before I hand it over to Amelia for a closing to thank you, and maybe we can stop this. Take the screen share down for a bit, just to do the closing, because we are running out of time, and we want to close. So if we can stop the sharing of the mural. Thank you so much. Really, thank you so much for all of your wonderful points here. Adriana, if you can stop the sharing just so we can close. Thank you. All right. So I just want to thank you as one of the partners here with the Women's Working Group. And also we have to mention our partners with the Civil Society Organization of Financing for Development. Together, we're pushing this through, but really with all of our partners that we've had. Thank you so much, Ale, Diana, and Tetet, for really making this a powerful session. Thank you so much. If we are not seeing each other later this week or at the end of the week, wish you lots of safety, lots of good health, and let's mobilize. Thank you. So we'll hand it over to Amelia to close it out.
Thank you so much.
Stay safe.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that if you go to the website, there is a section called Join Us, so you can also propose your activities to really directly engage with the Campaign of Campaigns. And we will, in that website as well, we have the social media of the Campaign of Campaigns so that you can start following us. And also we will be engaging with all of you. And thank you so much for this fantastic panel and session. It has been extremely inspiring, and this is just a small part of what these Global South Women's Forum is bringing us. So we are just so looking forward to everything that is coming. So thank you for the organizers as well. And thank you to everybody who's here. So we are inviting now all of you to open your mics so that we can at least take a glance of all of you. And
your cameras.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi.
You.
Hi.
Good to see you.
Stay safe, dear.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Turn on your mics and your cameras and say goodbye in your own language.
Adios.
Paalam.
Adios.
Salamat po.
Salamat po.
Adios.